This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome our witnesses and thank them for the testimony they prepared. Pretty interesting reading. I also want to ask unanimous consent while my ranking member's back is turned to enter my written statement into the record. And let me just start extemporaneously talking about this problem, because this is a hearing that I've been looking forward to. And I know our ranking member, even though he's not paying attention to me, has done an awful lot of work on this subject. But coming from the private sector, I look at the management of property, the ability to dispose of it in a cost-effective manner and one that's beneficial to government. This ought to be simple. This should not be this difficult. I know in my business in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, both is just a standalone business and then part of a larger corporation. There was just a pretty streamlined process. And, when I was part of a large corporation, you had a budgeting process. You'd certainly, if you wanted to, do a capital expenditure or a capital disposal, you propose that to management, people agree, and you get it done. You get you get some appraisals, you find out basically what the property is worth, and you sell it. Even if you had another division that may have been able to use it, you kind of put them on notice. You sell the piece of property, maybe we could have used it, but, well, then they can buy another piece of property. This should not be this difficult. But being briefed for this hearing, it seems like there's two basic problems. First of all, we don't have the information. 275,000 buildings are owned by the federal government, but we really don't have an idea what's the full value of that, how many are being fully utilized, how many are being underutilized. So you actually need information to solve a problem. I mean, there's the first problem. And then, with the best of intentions, I think Congress has probably created a number of hurdles, a lot of hoops that the agencies have got to go through to dispose of any piece of property. Again, making sure that if there's a piece of property that could potentially be used for a homeless shelter or in some other area of government, well, that just sets up a process that makes it extremely difficult and certainly lengthens out the process for disposing of property. So, again, the purpose of this hearing, as I was talking to the witnesses beforehand, is, let's make sure that we understand this problem. Let's admit we've got it, and let's agree on some pretty simple solutions here in terms of let's get the information we need, and let's cut through the red tape. Let's reduce those hoops. Let's make this a very streamlined process so we can manage property for the benefit of the American taxpayer. So again, I'm looking forward to it. Let's come up with solutions here, and with that, I'll turn it over to our ranking member, who really has worked pretty tirelessly on this issue, and hopefully we can succeed pretty quick. Dong, I'd like to start with you. Just kind of some basic metrics. In your testimony, you said that GSA has 377 million square feet of property basically under your management. Is that all of civilian property outside the Defense Department, or what do you have a figure in terms of what the government completely owns?
That is just a portion of the larger holdings within the federal government. I think it's probably about 10% of the total.
So you're saying the amount of number of square feet held by the federal government is over 3 billion square feet?
I think Mr. Mader would have the exact figure.
Mr. Mader, do you have that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and this is civilian and defense. There's a total of 254,000 buildings, owned buildings, 21,000 leased buildings, and that is 2.5 billion square feet of space for owned buildings and 295 million square feet for lease. So roughly, 2.7, almost 2.8 billion square feet of space.
So when you're talking about, Mr.
And that's
Mader,
all facilities.
So when you're talking about disposing of 21 million square feet versus 2,500 million square feet, I mean, we're talking about just an infinitesimal amount of disposals, correct?
We're talking about a small number, and I think we need to go back to Mr. Wise's testimony. What's included in that, for an example, let's say if you were in the Department of Interior National Park Service, if you had a facility that was sitting in a national park that was no longer useful and was declared excess, that would be included in that inventory. Obviously, other than demolishing that structure, there isn't any other use for it. So
But
it
again,
includes,
but that structure is costing money in terms of maintenance and repair.
absolutely,
which is part of the problem.
and that's why in the case of Interior, they actually have an aggressive program.
So out of the 2.5 billion square feet within this profile, or wherever the information would be captured, the federal real property profile or someplace else, in my mind, there'd probably be three categories that I would want to see. And I don't know the way you categorize it, but fully utilized properties, underutilized properties, and then non-utilized or excess properties. Is that how we categorize these things, or?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we actually put it in those three buckets. It's underutilized, unutilized, and then pure excess.
Do you have the breakdown then of the 2.5 billion square feet? How much is fully utilized of that?
I have it by building, not by square foot.
Well, I'll take it by building.
So in
But I would say by square foot it'd probably be as
we can provide that,
okay, great.
to you later. But
so what do you
I
have in
don't
terms of
that
buildings
today.
then?
So for buildings, we have 1,615 underutilized, 3,360 unutilized, and 4,465 pure excess, already declared excess.
It doesn't total up to the amount here. Maybe I'm missing your. I mean, you were saying you've got 275,000 buildings in total.
Yes, sir.
So I see 1,600.
These now the other buildings. The delta is buildings that are being utilized. So we categorize underutilized.
Okay.
Unutilized. Underutilized would be we're not maximizing.
That's 1615.
Right. Unutilized, meaning it may be temporarily vacant and being held for future use by an agency. And then the third category, pure excess.
Oh, pure, okay.
There's no use.
I got you. Mr. Maida, you're talking about, we need money to save money. There's a British and now Canadian concept of regulation, one in, one out. In business, I would, certainly the way I'd be looking at this is with all these, again, that's a lot of excess properties. That's close to 10,000 in some way, shape, or form. Just quick doing the math in my head. There's a lot of dollar value wrapped up in that, I would assume. Why wouldn't we utilize a goal, a discipline in the process of let's dispose of some, let's take those proceeds from that sale and utilize that for either further disposals or even for construction?
Mr. Chairman, if you go back to Mr. Wise's testimony, he talked about CIPRA, which was recommended by the administration several years ago and is actually in the President's 2016 budget. And basically, one of the key components of that is to do just exactly what you just described, and that is, retain some, not all, but some of the proceeds from the sale of excess property, and then use that then to prepare, as Mr. Dong testified, additional properties for disposal. So
again,
it sort of creates
why not,
a revolving fund.
Why not use it all rather than, as in your testimony, you asked for $2.4 billion in increased funding for disposals and property management?
Part of it is capacity. I don't think that, I think you get to the point where you can just handle so many properties in a year. And I also think that, as the administration proposed, we retain some for disposal, but the other remaining balance would go back into general receipts.
Mr. Wise, tell me, describe to me the greatest impediment to disposal of property. I mean, what hoops, what hurdles do federal employees and managers of these things have to go through just to get rid of a property? How long does it take to get rid of one?
The length of time varies tremendously, but the major issues involved are, number one, I think as you alluded to in your opening statement, we really don't have a great handle on exactly what we have and how it's being used. The real property data is still a work in progress in terms of improving the FRPP. So that's number one, and I think that as a federal manager in Washington or any other place, unless you have a really good handle on exactly what you have out there and its condition and how it's being used, it's kind of difficult to move the chess pieces in that sense. The other part of it is the disposal process. Again, as you mentioned in your opening statement, is a complicated process given the current legislative environment. And that's an area where perhaps Congress can be of assistance, and I believe the new amendment that was proposed is moving in that direction. And as Dave suggested, the CIPRA legislation also, when we testified several years ago, we mentioned that it looked like a step in the right direction in terms of being able to consolidate properties for a kind of an up or down decision, which would serve to mitigate or limit at least some of the competing stakeholder interests that also serve as challenges in trying to dispose of federal real property.
Just briefly, not to create conflict between witnesses, do you basically confirm what Mr. Mader was talking about in terms of the underutilized, the unutilized, and the excess? Are those rough? Do you think those are pretty accurate numbers, or do you think that's questionable?
Well, we prefer not to really speak in numbers at the moment because we're not confident enough in the FRPP data to take a stance other than that we don't think the figures or the data is reliable. So all the numbers that exist are really numbers that are provided by the Office of Management and Budget and other federal agencies. But many of our reports have proven time and time again that there are issues with the data that sort of undermine the aggregate compilations of kind of what you have out there and its condition and how it's being used.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Carper. And there's no doubt about it, like Senator Heitkamp was saying, this is not a partisan issue. This is a management issue. And I think there's a number of things we can do. You know, my suggestion always is, you know, take a step-by-step approach. Let's take the little elements. You know, maybe we can't do some big comprehensive reform, but let's take a look at the very common sense things we have to do. Let's start passing that. Let's try and get things passed through this committee, reported out unanimously, and let's start making some improvements here. So, again, I just want to thank all the witnesses for your time you took for your testimony. We will work very closely with you to provide those types of reforms, report out a piece of legislation that'll actually work. And with that, I think the hearing record will remain open for 15 days.
Mr. Chairman,
nope.
Are we done?
Yeah, I was going to close it out.
Round?
Sure. And I'm certainly committed to working with you and the gentlemen here that are witnesses to bring some reform to this issue. So again, you know, I want to thank the witness. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until July 1st at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.